Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hi and welcome back to the podcast. Thank you always for listening. Much appreciated. Don't forget to rate, review if you're liking it on all your podcast apps. Now, I have an absolutely fantastic episode lined up for you today. You might remember just before the US election last year, I interviewed on this podcast James Johnson. Now, James or JJ used to be Number 10's pollster when Theresa May was Prime Minister of the UK. The last couple of years, he's been operating out of the United States, and his research firm, JL Partners, was actually the only pollster to get or call the US election result right. And it shouldn't really be a surprise because so much of what JJ was talking about in that podcast he did with me in the weeks just before the vote came true. That lack of support amongst African Americans, particularly African American men, for Kamala Harris, and how, of course, foreign policy played into those elements of strength and held back, of course, Harris, as we now know. So I had always planned to check in with JJ after the US election to just see how things had shaken out. But I thought, why not expand that? Because so much of what is happening in the US not just only affects us in the UK and Australia directly, but it also, I think, does infect or play into our own politics and shape the trends and themes that we're seeing emerge here. So joining us today is also Luke Tryl. He is a former special advisor to David Cameron many years ago, and for many years has been working at More in Common, which is a fantastic organisation in the UK. They do a lot of research and work about essentially how to find the common threads that bind us together in our politics rather than divide and polarise us. I really recommend More in Common's work and particularly Luke's work. He is one of my go-to analysts for things in the UK on politics. Finally, and definitely not least, you're going to hear from Tony Barry, who is someone I have known. Well, put it this way. Tony Barry was dealing with me when I was a baby cub journalist in, I think, 2008, 2009. So we've known each other for so long. He was then working for former Liberal leader Malcolm Turnbull. For the non-Aussies, Liberal is, of course, in Australia, the Conservatives. And he now owns a private research company, RedBridge, with former Labor Party State Director Kos Samaras. And I really rate these guys' work too, because it's not just day-to-day sugar hit polls. They really extrapolate big picture stuff. They look at demographics. They look at things like where the migrant vote is changing. They look and break down gender in relation to wealth and earnings. And so they do a lot of really nitty-gritty work. And in my view, understand Australia like no other pollster operating in Australia right now. So I've got all three of these guys together. It's the first time they've all met, and I know they're going to go along really well. I began the chat by asking JJ about Trump's resurrection. If there were any surprises in that vote, because Trump, of course, did not just win the college, he won the popular vote, and he won groups that nobody really thought were going to swing his way.
So I think we definitely saw some of the big shifts. The biggest thing that we saw coming was the non-white vote, which turned significantly more Trump than it has been in quite some time, significantly more Republican than it has been in quite some time. That did have a gender split to it. Non-white men were more likely to shift. That shift has been some time coming amongst Hispanic voters. Over the last few elections, we've seen that change happening. But with black voters, that was a sharper shift than we've seen in recent years. In the same way that in the UK, and be interested to get Luke's views on this, in the same way that in the UK, the relationship between class and party broke down in the sort of 80s, 90s, going into the 2000s, we could be seeing the start of that with race in the US. Now, I don't think that's happening yet. I think it's early days. Race is still a massive determinant of vote. But I do think there is an unlinking, an unbuckling of that chain between race and vote. And I don't think that makes these people Republicans. I don't think that makes them pro-Trump forever, pro-Republican forever. But I do think it makes them swing voters. The thing that did surprise me, that we hadn't seen coming to this extent, was the younger vote being so evenly split between Harris and Trump. I expected Trump to make inroads there, especially with younger men. But actually, Trump did even better, I think, than really anyone was showing in their polling. And that speaks to, yes, that gender divide in the younger group, but also I think, again, it is not the default in Western democracies that younger people are more liberal anymore. We see that in Europe with some of the support for the populist parties in Europe, but we absolutely saw that with support for Trump. I think the final thing, Latika, is also that group of middle-class, middle-aged suburban women, white women, that Kamala Harris was really hoping were going to come over to her on abortion. Many of them did, but again, not quite by the numbers that you might have expected. And the fact that Trump was able to draw level with some of those female groups was also a real testament to his performance. I'll leave you with one quote from exactly one of those voters that I spoke to in Allentown in Pennsylvania, very middle-class area. She said she was undecided up till the end. She ended up backing Trump. And she said to me, I do care about abortion, but it doesn't matter if we've all been blown to oblivion. And her view is that actually stopping nuclear war and promoting global peace, which she saw as better under Donald Trump, was a bit more important to her than the abortion question. So perhaps that was one of those reasons that Trump did better in that group than I think anyone expected.
Yes, super fascinating. Okay, Luke Tryl, in the UK, we've heard this word a lot, which is what JJ just talked about, this word realignment. That's been happening for some time in the UK. Can you briefly outline what it is, how that manifests itself in the UK, and how permanent you see that being?
Yeah, just picking up from what James was talking about, there was a time when there were quite, or at least reasonably stable class voting patterns in the UK. Broadly, the Tories were the party of the middle and upper classes, and Labour, by virtue of its name and its founding, was the party of the working class. And that has been breaking down. There's a temptation to assume that pattern suddenly stopped in 2016 or 2019. Actually, it's been a gradual erosion of those buckets over time. And what we saw emerge much more clearly, particularly in 2019, but it persisted in 2024. It was just the scale of Labour's victory in seats obscured it, was that education became a much better predict how people would vote. And broadly, I'm slightly caricaturing, but the Labour Party and also some of the other parties to the left, I should say, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, became the party of those who had tended to do higher education, tended to be concentrated in urban, particularly university cities, whereas the Conservatives started to take a bigger chunk of those who hadn't done higher education. That's where we got to with 2019, with Boris Johnson winning that swathe of traditionally Labour seats in what has become known as the Red Wall in the UK. Again, it's possible to slightly overstate what happened in 2019. In fact, actually in 2017, Theresa May made a good job at chipping away at many of those seats. And actually in 2015, if you go back, you start to see some of the shift happening. But 2019, they flipped en masse, giving Boris Johnson that 80-seat majority. Fast forward to 2024, and I think it's better. There are some people who say, well, does that prove? Because what happened was lots of those seats did flip back. And that's true, but it paints a slightly misleading picture. The seats flipped back to Labour, but actually not very many of the voters in those seats did flip back to Labour. What actually happened in those red wall seats is you saw a big chunk of those who had gone Labour to Conservative going for Reform UK, the populist party of the right, led by Nigel Farage. And it is interesting, if you now look at the seats where Reform UK are in second place, the seats which should be their low-hanging fruit, most of them, I think it's 89 out of 100 or close to that, are Labour seats in those types of areas. Those former industrial heartlands that were Labour, Boris Johnson captured, and then went to Reform UK. So that's where we're at now. It's a mistake to think that kind of realignment or shift disappeared. It didn't. And what Labour did, it's worth also saying, if you look at Labour's 2024 coalition, still a higher proportion of those with a degree backed Labour, actually still more of those with GCSE or lower qualifications backed the Conservatives, but also Reform coming to the mix. Labour has this coalition, and I think this is going to be the big challenge for them throughout this parliament. People have described it as broad, but not very deep. So they won seats all over the place. They won South West Norfolk, Liz Truss's seat, Tory Bastion. They won Aldershot, Millerstown. They also won Blythe. But they've also got their seats in places like Bristol, where they're under attack from the Greens. So it's a really interesting dynamic. It's given them a big majority. I think it sets them up for some challenges that we're already seeing in terms of public opinion down the line.
Tony Barry, is the realignment happening in Australia, and is it happening to the same degree given Australia's compulsory and preferential voting system, which I must say, after living in the UK, I now think it's the best and most stable voting system in the world. But are any of those trends playing out to the same degree in Australia?
Yeah, those realignments are happening here. We're seeing with the centre-left parties and the centre-right parties, whilst they don't have probably the extremities because of that compulsory voting system, which brings a lot of voters into play that probably would normally not get out and vote. So consequently, the extremities aren't there, but that disconnect or that realignment is happening. We saw it with the Liberal Party, which is the Conservative Party in Australia, which started disconnecting from its base, the seats that were blue ribbon Liberal. That disconnection started about 20 years ago, but it accelerated over the last sort of half a dozen years. And at the last federal election here, there was a totemic shift where these seats, which had always been Liberal, have been lost to the so-called Teals, which is an independent party that's allegedly, they bill themselves as having Liberal with Green tendencies. But at the same time, in this current parliamentary term, what we're seeing more evidence of is Labor starting to disconnect from their base. Now, whether it's going to be a long, slow divorce, so to speak, which happened with the Liberal Party and their base remains to be seen. But we're seeing in the crosstabs for blue-collar workers, the Liberal Party is suddenly incredibly competitive with that cohort. We're finding with that where those homes where English is a second language, or those homes where people were born overseas. Look, in the urban centres of Melbourne and Sydney, just over a third of voters were born overseas. So it's a huge cohort. And what we're finding is those voters in this term are now starting to disconnect from Labor as well. The Indian diaspora, for example, are incredibly asset accumulators. They want choice, whether it be in health, private health or public health. They want choice in education. And so they're sort of looking for something a little bit more than what Labor is offering. And they're starting to disconnect there. And you can see the opposition leader here, Peter Dutton, is targeting that cohort strenuously at the moment because he recognises those votes are up for grabs. So there are realignments happening all over the shop at the moment. I think it's all underpinned by grievance in the electorate, like everywhere else around the world at the moment. Inflation is political kryptonite, and it's killing governments left and right. But it's fermenting this incredible grievance in the electorate and this frustration. And the one thing in Australia is that compulsory system has produced a combined vote of over 90%, say 25 years ago. And now the combined vote of the major parties is at 69%. And it's trending downwards every single federal election.
Okay, you've all raised some really interesting and common themes there. Let's go back to JJ, because I think the US really does lead on a lot of these trends. JJ, we're seeing President Trump 2.0 react very strongly to DEI, wokeness, political correctness. Is there any danger here that he's going to overreach, or is this something that the American public really desires? And Tony and Luke, I'll ask you to come in on here and where you think DEI and political wokeness and political correctness kicks in your jurisdictions as well. JJ.
Yeah, look, I don't think it's ever going to be the top issue that voters vote on in the US, but it's an important thing that voters use to work out how they feel about candidates. So I don't think it necessarily mattered exactly what the Trump campaign managed to successfully paint Kamala as backing on trans, I think it was trans surgery for prisoners was the exact charge. The details of that didn't so much matter. It was more that it created a sense that there was a disconnect between her and the average American, which Trump was able to fulfill. I think what made that ad in particular super strong was less the attack on Kamala, more the fact that they then pivoted to, but Trump understands you. Trump gets it. And I think that is effective. And I think that clearly was successful. The ins and outs of these things are not a huge thing for voters. I see a lot of commonality in my American focus groups to what I see in British focus groups, that generally people's view are just like, let people live how they want and let people get on with their lives. But they increasingly see that taken to an almost absurd level in the public discourse. The prisoners thing being an example, pronouns, other things as well. I think on the broader DEI stuff, I'm not sure that does pose much of a risk for Donald Trump, at least in the American climate. I think that people are increasingly of the view that a lot of this stuff has gone too far. They don't want it to, as I say, seem nasty or aggressive or singling out a particular group, but they do feel that it's broadly gone too far, and that gives a lot of permission, I think, for the sort of perspective that Trump is taking. It's interesting on the woke stuff. When I started, everybody really started thinking about this sort of, I don't know, 6-7 years ago, perhaps. I was very much in the camp of it doesn't matter too much, voters dismiss it, it's hard to make it into a thing that actually sticks with voters. I've changed that view because the more time elapses, the more people cancel culture or woke stuff touches. And it then becomes an issue for people who they never thought about it before. I've got the worst crime, a cardinal sin of a pollster here, which is to use an extreme anecdotal example, which is an ex-girlfriend who was always quite positive, didn't really care about woke, was always quite positive about it. And then one day she said, my favourite podcast has been cancelled. And she was furious, and it had radicalised her. And I think that is happening around the US, and I think that is happening around in other democracies as well, whether it's people's podcasts, whether it's something they've said at work, whether it's a friend they've heard who's got in trouble for making a joke. It's all gone a little too far for them, and I think that gives a lot more permission. I also think, by the way, that it's important for that race effect that I was talking about. A lot of the black voters that I spoke to who were turning to Republicans for the first time, they spoke explicitly about being viewed as a separate race, and they actually wanted measures that improve their lot in life, made them richer, made them more likely to get a job, improve their local area, rather than always being viewed as a member of a race that should always vote for a political party. So I think that rhetoric has also actually brought non-white people themselves, who a lot of this rhetoric is purportedly aimed at, more into the fold of the right.
Okay, that's really fascinating. Tony Barry, Australia is approaching an election. Do you see any mood in the public for a bit of a copycat of what Trump is doing here? Or do you think Australians actually inherently really don't want that Americanization of politics in Australia?
There is a touch of that sort of woke here, but it's more, as James said, it's evidence to voters that you don't share their priorities. You don't have shared values. I'm concerned about paying this week's mortgage or rent, and this bozo is talking about an issue that is just not on my radar. So it's a proof point to people that there's no shared values and perhaps no shared experience. And I think that's driving this sort of discontent. And I think there's been a few situations here in Australia where the current Prime Minister, who's from the Labor Party, has followed these sort of issues to his detriment, because the anxiety in the electorate over cost of living pressures and housing affordability in Australia is so intense that if you're not talking to them on that language, then it's a language they don't understand. And a lot of this woke language it's just a language they don't understand and they don't relate to and they don't have time for.
Luke, here in the UK, we see Kemi Badenoch, who is a migrant. She's the new leader of the Conservative Party. She was born in Nigeria. She looks very different. She sounds very different. And she's got these issues she wants to go out and be ballsy about, one being migration and a lot of this political correctness about how we talk about integration in the UK. Why is she doing that? Do you think it's going to be successful? And is it even necessary for the Conservatives at this point to be talking about these issues?
I think the thing with Kemi Badenoch is that perhaps, unlike a lot of recent prime ministers, she has a deep theory of what has gone wrong with the state. She has thought a lot through, for instance, her experiences with things like handling the fallout from the post office scandal, which was where, the UK post office was wrongly accusing its postmasters of fiddling money. Some went to jail, some committed suicide. It was a terrible scandal. And so she's got this theory that the state isn't working for lots of people. And I think it could be quite a powerful frame, but I think she's got to find a way of articulating it, which sounds a little bit less online, which connects with people's everyday. It is certainly the case that I often say one of my favorite stats, because I think it's so revealing, is that the proportion of people in the UK who think that levels of immigration should be increased is the same as the proportion of people who deny climate change. It is a really fringe belief. There is an acceptance, I think, across almost everyone who is sensible that we need to get a greater control of immigration. But not just that, we also need to look at the rights and responsibilities of people who have come over. And I think, in particular, so the recent events we've seen have shot integration to the top of the agenda. In fact, we polled on Kemi's recent statement in her speech that people who didn't want to integrate should have their visas revoked. And it won't surprise anyone on this call to know that it got really significant support. So I think she's very much chiming with the public mood. I think she also recognises that one of the big reasons that the Conservatives got booted out of office were their continued pledges to control immigration, and they failed to do that. The question is, after only 6 months, are voters really willing to look and say, we had that party for 14 years and we ended up with net migration almost at 1 million. Do we really trust that the party changed? And I think that is her challenge more than not focusing on the right issues.
Tony Barry, I want to come back to you here because there's two issues. I mean, normally Australia is the latent factor, but I actually think on these two issues, Australia has been the lead factor or the lead on in public opinion on these issues, and that's climate change and migration, as we've been talking about. Do you see this global backlash against the climate agenda as something more permanent now, or do you think in Australia, where we've gone wildly back and forth between wanting and opposing climate measures, that we're at this point of, no, we've landed where we are, we support net zero, we support renewables, maybe even nuclear in there?
In Australia, cost of living is so pervasive as an issue. And as a consumer and supplier of pollen for 25 years, I've never seen an issue dominate the profile agenda like it has now. Around 70% of voters for about 18 months now have nominated as their number one issue. Typically in Australia, the number one issue, whether it be health, education, climate change, economy, taps out at 30%. So 75% is unprecedented numbers. And consequently, climate change and every other issue has fallen down the scale. When you ask them qualitatively, why is it that an important issue to you, whereas it was 2 years ago, they're almost a unanimous response is, I've got more immediate problems. I'm behind on my mortgage. I'm behind on my rent. I can't meet the grocery bills. I'm having to make tough choices. You hear these very emotive stories about mums having to return some food from the checkout, so the ice cream and the biscuits, the family treats, because they're $25 over budget. And it's embarrassing for them, and their partner doesn't always understand. How come you couldn't make the grocery budget meet? So these are just so pervasive right now that climate change has fallen down in terms of salience. And that gives them permission to scrutinise it more objectively. And of course, one of the claims of the climate change supporters, renewable energy, is that it's cheaper. But in Australia, their shared experience is the complete opposite. Prices are still going up significantly. Now, the pointy heads will point out that a lot of those costs are up front, building infrastructure and so forth, and prices should come down. Energy costs should come down in the future, but all voters are seeing their bills, they're going up. They're skeptical as to whether these are ever going to be passed on. Their trust in all institutions, whether it be politics, media, and corporate, especially at the moment, are at all-time lows. I think that's consistent across the United States and the United Kingdom markets. And so consequently, a lot of these arguments about renewable energy just aren't landing at the moment, which is not to say public opinion is never static. If cost of living if there's relief on the horizon, it could rise in salience again and be a differentiated issue.
JJ, any of that resonate in the US, or do you think it's more ideological that Trump is now driving back on things like EV mandates? He wants to drill, baby, drill.
I think it's ideological to some extent. I do also think it's born in some sort of sense of reality that, remember, Trump talks about this in terms of common sense. He says this is a common sense thing to do. And that does tally with what a lot of voters feel. Voters are in the place of do both, do green energy and do oil and gas. Their view is do what makes it cheaper for me. We probably shouldn't totally cast out the green stuff because everyone, when I do focus groups, it's quite hard to find someone actually who is anti-helping the environment, even if they don't believe in climate change. It's become a sort of socially desirable thing to want to do for voters. So they don't want to leave that element behind. But I do think they're pragmatic. And I do think that for a lot of people, the Biden LNG ban, the export ban, as well as closing the Keystone pipeline early in his presidency, those were not top of mind conversations for voters, but they were perhaps a bit more widespread than you might think. They weren't as techie as they sound, and people were frustrated by those decisions and just thought it was weird. Why would you do that? It comes back to that common sense point. Look, this is where it intersects massively with corporate interests, right? And corporate clients and people who want to, message their sort of energy source and show that there's buy-in from the administration and show that there's buy-in from the voters. I'm sure they're conversations that the kind of conversations that Tony and Luke are having with their corporate sector clients as well. And I think that the message I give to them and the message that I'd say overall is there is almost for any energy source, there is permission for that from voters, but you've got to message it in a way that resonates. The simply saying this is the best thing for the climate doesn't really wash anymore. You've got to tie it back to cost, and you've also got to tie it back to energy independence, which is less of an issue in the US because it is hugely energy independent, but is also something that voters are wary of, especially in a context of tariffs and so on, and perceived, if not real, trade surpluses. I think there's an avenue for everyone. It's just about linking it right back to the interests of the consumer.
Luke, JJ mentioned right at the start there that you couldn't take the young vote being progressive anymore for granted. Is that something that you're seeing in the UK as well? And is this a bit of a warning to perhaps the left-wing groups that want to consistently lower the voting age? Should they be a bit more careful about what they're wishing for here?
I think definitely. I actually think the warning would be less to the left and more to established parties. Be careful what you wish for, because the really interesting thing that we see in our voting, obviously there's been a lot of talk about younger people opting for Reform UK. It's worth saying, like, the most likely group to vote for Reform UK is still Gen X men. But the interesting thing about Reform's voter profile in the UK is it's relatively flat. So they get about 20% amongst young people, which is pretty extraordinary, you might think, for a party of the populist, and similar figures actually for young men, but it's consistent and slightly tails off amongst older generations. But the other side, the flip side, which I think is really interesting, is in our polling basically since the election, the Green Party have been leading amongst Gen Z women in our polling as well, which again I think mimics patterns that you see around the world, in that you've got the certain cohort of young men who are more attracted to figures on the more populist right. And again, in our polling, the only group in the UK that would have voted for Donald Trump over Kamala Harris if they could vote is men under 35. So you've got them going in this direction, but then you've got young women increasingly being pulled towards more liberal parties as well. So it's a really interesting, dynamic. And the overall thing, which is also interesting, is when you look at the blocks, if you assume Conservatives and Reform are a right-wing bloc and Labour, the Liberal Democrats and Greens are a left-wing bloc, between men and women overall, there's very little difference between those two blocks, similar numbers of men and women voting right and left. The differentiation within those blocks is really interesting. Men in the right bloc more likely to vote Reform, women more likely to vote Conservative still. And in the left bloc, interestingly, men more likely to vote Labour, women more likely to vote for the Greens and the Liberal Democrats. We actually have Labour in third place amongst at the moment. So it's interesting that sorting that is going on within there, even though the left and right numbers are the same.
Tony Barry, is the male vote anything to weaponise in the Australian upcoming election? Because we're seeing that bro vote. I mean, we obviously saw that with Elon Musk and Donald Trump and the way the administration has been messaging since. Is there anything happening in Australia?
Yeah, there is a definite gender split happening, which I think is driven more by their issues profiles, which are becoming quite dispersed. Cost of living is something we've talked about. The nuclear energy debate nuclear energy as an energy source is far more accepted by males, especially younger males. Globalists, we find even younger females, globalists who've travelled to Europe, and when you ask them in focus groups, they're like, I've seen them all around France, nuclear reactors. I don't see what the big deal is. With the older generation, they see Chernobyl. But the profiles are differing in the gender split right now. Probably more anxiety amongst the female cohort, whether it be health and education of their children, the cost of living pressures, as we've covered, even things like energy sources. You're finding the voting patterns are matching those gender splits and those profile splits, depending on the party that they think is more relevant to the profile.
So one thing I want to ask you all about is this complete collapse in the information space that we're seeing. Obviously, I'm a mainstream media person. I feel this acutely every day. But I think it's also now the case that even social media is following that path of legacy media in collapsing, disintegrating, becoming very fragmented and confused. And I would argue we are entering an age of mass confusion. How is that affecting how people are understanding politics, where they're getting their information sources, how you think that lends itself to conspiracy theories, fringe views, or not? Maybe, JJ, if you want to start with that, because I think we've seen it most in the US.
Yes, it is incredibly diverse information ecosystem here. And as you say, social media is also fragmented in that way too. It's interesting, whenever you start a focus group or an interview with where do you get your news from, you always get this sort of very grand response of I Google it and I read lots of different sources and then I make up my mind based on all of that. Now, I suspect that's true for about 1% of people I talk to. I think other people perhaps doth protest too much about what they do. And actually, they are tending to get it from one source regardless. That is obviously increasingly social media and these different sources. Like, what does that mean? On the one hand, it means no dominant narrative takes shape. It's certainly something that it's ultra democratic, really, in the US sphere. I do find that interesting. And there are lots of different ideas bashing around. There is no one establishment or even anti-establishment narrative out there. On the other hand, of course, it means that there is less rigor and more of a chance of wild things popping up on someone's internet feed or whatever, social media feed, and them taking it very seriously.
And are you seeing that come up in the focus groups? Are you seeing people less informed than they used to be or misinformed?
I definitely think you do get people quoting disinformation a lot more, particular sort of stories or examples that have been discredited but are still viral and going around. That is certainly the case. But people are also really sensitive to being told that what they think is disinformation, because sometimes they've seen that, frankly, be proven wrong. A great example is that for 2 years, mainstream media in the US, to the extent that it exists, particularly on the liberal side, but actually other right-leaning papers and networks as well, didn't touch what was clearly mental decline in the US president. Everybody could see it clear as day, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. And after that debate, everybody suddenly felt proven quite right and felt that that the mainstream media leapt down their throats and told them that was wrong or that they were crazy. It also works both ways. I will say one final thing about how this has played out. Clearly, it has put people into more camps in the US. And we can talk about the surprise size of Trump's victory, but the fact is that the US is still very sharply divided on partisan grounds. And that is the most obvious point ever, but that is definitely exacerbated by people being in echo chambers on social media because of this diffuse information network. I will say one thing which I have discovered since moving to the US a few years ago is that there is a surprise upside to that polarization. And it strikes you in the focus groups, which is that at any given point, about 40% of the country are quite happy with how things are going. In the UK, everyone's unhappy. There is something.
As someone who moved to the UK, I think that's just the permanent psyche of the Brits. I'm sorry.
Might be a permanent psyche, but there is something about democratic vitality there that it can lend. People do care. There's no denying that.
Okay, Luke, do you want to take that one on?
Yeah, I guess I'd add a couple of things. The UK is not immune to that ideological sorting by news consumption that we see elsewhere. It's definitely much more diffuse. It does remain the case, despite its many detractors, that when you ask people, the BBC tends to remain the most trusted news source and does give at least some core of shared information, although it has its detractors. Interestingly, though, its detractors tend to be more engaged, more partisan people rather than the public at large. So there's that there. But I also think two things. I think one thing is there is a lot of thinking which goes into, and I think this particularly happens on the left, which is if only we were able to tackle these right-wing information systems, if only there wasn't misinformation, we would be victorious every time. And they spend so long thinking about that. I often compare it to, I don't know if you've seen Wicked, this view that if only we can pull back the wizard's curtain and expose him, everyone would love Elphaba and dislike the wizard. But of course, that isn't the case. And I think what people, particularly on the left, neglect is the demand side of this stuff. They're obsessed with the supply side, algorithms, echo chambers. They don't look at the demand side. Why are people going to this source of news? Why are they dissatisfied with what they're hearing elsewhere? And one of the most interesting pieces of work that we did was looking at people's attitudes to the conflict in Gaza. And this was a group of people who were very much more sympathetic to the Palestinian side in the conflict. And I showed them one of those AI-altered images of, it was a terrible image of children being caught up in the conflict, but it was very clear that one of the kids had 6 fingers. So it was not real. And they didn't notice that to begin with. And then I said, okay, now that had 6 fingers, it was misinformation online. And they said, yeah, but it doesn't matter because it's telling the reality of what's happening there anyway. So it doesn't matter that image itself wasn't true. And I think that is something that is worth digging into because for lots of people, this is about reconfirming their priors. So as I say, and particularly in lots of what we do more in common, what is the demand side? Why are people unhappy with the diet they're getting from the establishment or established media? And how can you make that more responsive to what people actually want?
That is absolutely fascinating. So it's like confirming your truth. It doesn't matter if it is true or not. Tony Berry, how do you see the information system in Australia affecting the way people consume their politics and may be susceptible or not to various messages?
Yeah, very similar to what JJ and Luke were talking about, this sort of tribalism. It's not just in terms of voting patterns, but also in terms of media consumption. So people are trying to find their tribe, whether it be their political tribe or their media tribe. And they tend to, Australian media is now quite tribal and they find the tribe that they relate to the best and they don't really want to hear alternative views or a so-called objective position. They find comfort in, as you said, their own truth or reaffirming their own views of the world or their own biases. So we are seeing this kind of fragmentation and tribalism, but at the same time, we're also seeing the legacy media outlets and so forth are being challenged by a lot of the emergence of, say, podcasts, hosts with a particular profile. Globally, Joe Rogan is the obvious one that comes to mind, where people have this connection with the individual. We've got some Australian sort of commentators as well, where voters or the public have a real connection, personal connection to that person. They trust them. And so they're interested in their views. And of course, a lot of these commentators have an interest in attacking the credibility of mainstream media, and they can respond quicker. They can correct themselves, as they often do, and that builds further credibility and trust with their audience. These sort of ecosystems of individuals, hosts, are becoming very powerful, not just globally, but I think in Australia as well. And it's also, you can see the smart campaigns now adjusting their free media to latch onto podcasts, but in a vertical way. Like a political podcast in Australia is only followed by people like me, not real people. So in that regard, if you can get onto Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, did one with Mark Bouris, who's a finance bro, and he has a big audience. People trust him, obviously. They're interested in what his views are, and Dutton has piggybacked onto his audience who aren't normally politically engaged, not silly, but not politically engaged. And that vertical content allows him to speak to an audience that he normally wouldn't speak to. And I think Trump did that to a large extent as well. It's the everywhere, everything, all the time sort of media strategy at the moment.
Okay, final question. Luke, you focus on healing polarization or trying to understand themes that could bring an end to polarization. If you're advising, you've all worked in government, if you're advising the PM today, what's the one or two things you would say to them to achieve in order to start healing the polarization that we're seeing?
I don't see polarization as, I think there's a tendency to view it as something almost separate to everything else, or to view cohesion as something about how we make people nicer to each other. It's actually inseparable from James's point about the sort of pervasive sense of national misery. If you think everything is getting worse, if you think the pie is getting smaller, you are going to come into conflict with people around you. So I think there are two things that need to be done. One is, this is obviously easier said than done, you've got to convince people democracy can deliver the outcomes that they expect from it, right? You've got to show you can get the NHS working, show that at the end of the weekly shop, you won't have to put stuff back, show that actually politicians are responsive to voters' concerns on immigration, on housing, the right approach to doing climate. So there is a delivery element, and I think that is certainly the bet that this government have put on. But I do think there's something else as well, because clearly we talked about young men, we talked about disillusionment, we talked about media. There is something about respect which has been awesome. And one of the most profound things when I do focus groups, particularly of those people who are more tempted to go away from the mainstream parties, is this profound feeling of disrespect by the system. They think that respect has become aligned with having a degree, living in London, earning lots of money, and that we've lost things like respect for contribution. And so I think there's some deeper thinking about how do you demonstrate respect for contribution? How do you make it so that if you work hard, you do the right thing, that's recognized by people? You could do that partly through the welfare system. You could do that in rules around immigration. You can do it in a few ways. You can do it by making sure we invest in areas outside of big cities. But I think that respect piece is as important as the delivery piece, because you can deliver all you want, but if people still think the system isn't working for them, they're not going to do it.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. JJ, what would you say for America, the united or divided states of America?
Well, look, there's only so much you can do. Yeah, it ain't going to happen is my, it's my first answer. This is a two-party system. This is a fragmented media landscape. This is a country that thrives on this, I think. Look, maybe we will have another era where there is more consensus in American politics. Perhaps that takes shape because of a particular policy issue or a particular cultural shift. I think we are seeing that consensus on some issues now that we haven't seen it on before in the past, such as immigration. If you'd have said in 2016 that in 9 years' time that you would have polls showing Democrats supporting mass deportations of illegal migrants, I think you'd have thought you were making it up, but that is the case, and it's becoming more of a consensus issue.
Yeah, I guess I should rephrase the question to you, actually, though. If you have a piece of advice for the Democrats, how they could become contestable again.
Interesting, yeah. So that, I think, is... There's a lot of overlap with Luke's answer, I think, because the same thing applies. A lot of voters who didn't back the Democrats this time either thought they were out of touch or felt that they didn't get the fact that they work hard, they put in, and they don't get rewarded. And that basic sense of fairness, you could copy and paste that between US and UK focus groups. Be interested in Tony's thoughts about how that links to Australia. But it is the fundamental thing, and it's that feeling of not a sort of macro societal equality fairness, but for me, I put the hours in, I work hard, I don't get rewarded. And I think it's about the Democrats really having a story on that feels real, that doesn't feel manufactured, that doesn't feel like a soundbite. I actually think it's one of the reasons Biden did quite well in 2020, is that he had a story on that, especially for those white working class voters who ended up going to him and then going back to Trump in 2024. Respect, keyword, I think that's absolutely crucial. I also think that Democrats need to have a tough conversation with themselves about the woke stuff and how much they talk about that in public compared to how much they might talk about it at a DC or Beltway dinner party. But yeah, I think there are roots in. The final thing is the person. This is a presidential system. And ultimately what matters is having a really good leader and candidate. And I actually don't think that Trump would have won if he didn't have that sense of strength, authenticity, even in the difficult economic situation and inflation situation that the US faced. It was that sense that he could get things done, that he wasn't afraid to say what he thought, and that he had a record of achievement. And that's what did it. And the Democrats need to find somebody who feels real like that. The worst thing in the focus groups in the closing days of that US election campaign for Kamala Harris was the fact that I think she could answer a question. They didn't think she just answered a question directly. And if you look at some of the clips, you'd be tempted to agree with them. And that sense of authenticity and just bloody answer the question, a very British way of putting it, but definitely applies in the US too, is absolutely key. So they've got to get the substance right, but they've got to get the candidate right too.
Okay, Tony, you're up last. It's an election in Australia very soon. You're advising Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, or opposition leader Peter Dutton. What do you say to them about how to win, but also to try and put back some of that support for maybe the two-party system if you're so inclined?
Yeah, I think those themes that James and Luke articulated so well about respect but authenticity, 100% correct, applies here as well. I think in Australia, though, I think in campaigns generally, values are more important than policies. Policies are an expression of your values. But, the people are voting upon shared values. And also comes with that, and this speaks to respect and so forth, is shared experiences. And I think COVID was an example, I think globally, but especially in Australia, where we're not a country of shared experiences anymore. And COVID was a classic example of that. The experience of the wealthier inner suburban professional class was entirely different than the outer suburban blue collar working across the gig economy and exposed all the time, as opposed to working from home and working online. The very different experiences, and that has really accelerated this kind of disconnect in Australia right now. So I think in terms of the Australian leaders, I'd be getting back to values. And we actually did a question on a national sample about, we put forward not just the major parties, but also some of the minor parties, the Greens, the Teal Independents, which is effectively a party. And we said, which of the following parties best represents your values? And a quarter said none of them.
Oh.
And close to 40% did not pick the Coalition or Labor, the two major offerings, which is more, as I said before, the vote share of those two parties in a compulsory system is 69% at the moment. So 31% don't vote for either on a primary vote basis. But 40%, an extra 9 points, don't feel any sort of connection or values at all to those parties. But yes, when a quarter don't find any party offering where they have shared values, speaks to that massive gap that there is there to fill for political parties. I think getting back to values, expressing those values and shared values for the electorate, and then having salient but differentiated policies from your opponent on those particular values is a way to reconnect with a larger vote share, I think.
Okay, interesting. You all three gave answers I was not expecting. So I'm very pleased to be so surprised. Guys, thank you so much. World's best pollsters. James Johnson of JL Partners, Tony Barry from RedBridge, and Luke Tryl from More in Common. Thank you for joining Latika Takes, the podcast. You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.